just going to be recording. And so we're going to continue where we left off last week, where we were working on the little turtle character. So I'll just close this file, open recent actually, floating bug. And so like I said, I'm a little under the weather, so I may or may not talk as much this time. But definitely there's some things I want to finish on this guy. So if you remember last time I had started this in Blender to get the base mesh model. I unwrapped it in Blender and then I brought it into 3D Coat for texture painting. And this is basically ultimately what I would like to end up with. So you notice that this guy has spikes on his shell and some legs. So I do at some point plan to create those in here as well. Hopefully I'll get to that today. Like I said, I may or may not talk quite as much as I normally would, but hopefully it'll still be valuable to follow along. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to go to start. I'm going to go to my Sculpt tab. I'm going to do something here. I'm going to go to View. I want to show my paint object. Show my poly objects in the sculpt room. So the sculpt room is a little bit different from the paint room. The paint room is showing me a low poly object, whereas the sculpt room, I'm going to have access to some of my high poly sculpting tools. Right now, I'm just showing this object here. I can't actually manipulate it with my brushes. It's just here for a reference if I want to be able to add some things in, which in my case I do. I want to add these spikes, which I will then retopologize and add to my mesh. So first off, I'm going to go to Sphere. I'm going to select my Sphere tool. I'm also going to turn on Symmetry. So make sure Enable Symmetry is on. X-axis Symmetry is enabled. And so one issue that I'm having right now is the fact that my object, if I draw a sphere right here, it's just drawing in the middle of the object. It's not picking up the fact that I want to draw it on the shell. And that's because this object is coming from the paint room. It's not a sculpt object. So what I need to do, I can go here to paint, and I just want to hide the visibility of this object momentarily. And I can actually do this from the sculpt room. So I'll do it, I'll go to Windows, pop-ups, and pop-ups, and paint objects. And then I'll see that this is the actual object here. It has the name cube. That's the name I started with in Blender. I'll give this a more appropriate name. This will be Turtle Robot. I'll hide the visibility of this momentarily, and then I'll just tighten this up. So I'm going to use my cutoff tool. So again, still in the sculpt room. Just using my cutoff tool, I'm going to cut off the parts I don't want. Okay. So the brush type I'm using here is a Lasso Brush. In cutoff mode, it's automatically going to use a marquise type brush. So either the square, rectangle, polygonal lasso, circle, or ellipse tool. All right, then I can bring back the visibility of my turtle. So that's a start. I need to shape these better. So I'm going to resample these objects first of all. I can see how dense these polygons are right here. It tells me that I have 134,000 polygons, triangles. So you can actually see if I press W, you can see how many little triangular faces this is made up out of. So I'm going to go ahead and press W again just to remove that. I'm going to resample this though. So the way I resample is I can go to the very bottom here and I have an option to resample. This is basically trying to keep the same shape but changing the number of polygons. So I'm going to resample this very low to about 8,000 polygons. And you'll see if I press W again, you'll see that it's not quite as dense, the triangulation here. And now I'm going to press Smooth All. So I'll do this a few times. And that's basically just taking this sculpt object and smoothing everything out. I use these functions so much that I set them to hotkeys. So in my case, I've set resample to Control-Shift-R and Smooth All to Control-Shift-S. Okay, so now that I have these kind of where I want them, I'm going to go in with my Move tool and just move things into place. Try to get a more of a spikiness going here. I want to consider the texture that I have underneath to make sure that it's in the right position. So it's working well with these textures. I'll probably push this one back slightly. And my drawing there is more of a guide than anything. I can kind of use it as a reference jumping off point if I'm ever unsure of what I want to do, or if my concept is not coming out nicely, I can always refer back to my drawings. However, I want to remain open to making changes. So sometimes the things that I'm doing won't necessarily work. So I want to be open to changing them. So right now I'm using my Move brush still, but I'm using a different alpha. So this is the alpha. So this one's, you'll notice from the red line on my brush, it's going to give it a little slightly pointier movement. Okay, great for making the spikes. Okay, and just smooth that a few times again. Okay, I'll make a few more. Actually, I'll move this one forward a little bit. You'll notice that my texture on my shell is not totally symmetrical, whereas these sculpt objects are. So even though these look like these are working in perfect symmetry, it's not working quite as well with the shell. So I'll have to fix that up later. I'll just add a few more of these. And instead of using my sphere tool to start, I'll use my primitives tool. And that's going to allow me to position an object specifically where I want it to be. Change its size. I have a whole slew of different primitives here. And the best way to think about these is stamps. So these are stamps, like 3D stamps. So when I get it in the place that I want it, I can basically press enter. It's going to stamp this into the scene. I can tell when I'm seeing this patchiness, that basically means I have two objects fighting for Z depth. They're basically occupying exactly the same space. And that's why that happens. That basically tells you that you've stamped it into the scene correctly. So I'll just position two more on either side. Or sorry, one more. Because I have symmetry, we can see that the other one's going to appear as well. Again, I'll press enter when I'm happy with the position. I'll do a couple more. So I'll move this back like so. Maybe make it a little smaller. Press enter. Move it into the center again. If I want to get it right in the center, I can see I have my X, Y, Z position. I can set the X position to 0 for more precision. Press enter. And I'll do one more row. Enter. Move this down. in a little bit, enter. All right. So I think that should be pretty good. They're not quite in the same positions as they are here. I also like these rivets that I have on this version. So I may or may not try to incorporate that. For now, I'll leave it. So these will be spikes. I'll just give it a name. So this is a voxel object that I've been creating these things on. So if I make this invisible, we can see that that's going to disappear. I have these shaders as well. So when I click on a shader, it's basically going to change the appearance of that voxel layer. So if I want it to look metallic or some kind of damaged metal, I can use one of these. Not super important at this stage. Really, I just want to make sure I nail down the shapes. So I'll have that. Right now, I'll create the legs as well. I'll create a layer for the legs. So here in my Vox tree, I'm just going to click this here. If you've used Photoshop, this will be familiar to you. It's basically going to create a new voxel layer. I'll call this legs. And then basically, I'm just going to create the robot's legs on this layer. I'll use a different tool for this. I'll use my curves tool. And my curves, basically, you'll see how it works. I can basically position an orb. And then if I put two orbs, you'll see that it's going to draw a line between them. Right here where the default movement is going to be extrude, I want to set that to move. So now if I drag on one of these, it's going to move it. The other thing I want to change, the profile. So right now you'll notice that the end of this is very abrupt. It's flat because the profile is set to straight. I want to set this to hemisphere. Okay, so that I have more of a curved appearance there. So I want to position these legs the way I want them. 3D Coat, again, at this point, is fairly buggy software. This version is fairly buggy. I'm going to press Control S to save because I don't want to lose my progress at the wrong time. So try to get these legs flowing the way I want. Again, this is almost exactly like the primitives tool, whereas this is actually a stamp. And when I'm happy with its overall position, I basically press enter to stamp a version into the scene. So I'm going to press enter once I'm happy with that. And so I have my first leg. I'm going to change the layer resolution. So you'll notice that this layer in particular has 190,000 triangles. If I go here, visible triangles, that's showing how many triangles are visible amongst all my voxel layers. And then current object basically says how many triangles are on my current layer. So you'll see that this layer is going to be very dense relative to the other layer. We also have a little indicator here. So that by virtue of this saying 0.03, that basically means the resolution of this layer is 1/3 or 30% of a regular layer. So I'm going to do the same thing for the legs. I'm going to resample them. Control Shift R, and it is not giving me a dialog. I might have to change off of my curves tool, so I'll go to cut off momentarily. Control Shift R, I'll just bring that down. So now I have a low resolution layer here too, 13,000 triangles total, which is good. Ideally, we want to work with as low resolution when sculpting as possible. So I'm going to go back to my curves tool. You'll notice we still have that stamp in place. I'm going to go to move again. I'm going to go to click on this box, transform curve. And now if I click on one of these, it's going to allow me to transform the entire curve altogether. I want to again position this where I want it to be. Rotate it a little bit. And I want 6 legs total, so I just want to make sure I'm leaving enough space for that. So go ahead and press enter when I'm happy with the position. Oops. And then I'll just move this one more time. And once again, press enter when I'm happy. If I want to get rid of the curve, I can simply press escape and then it'll be gone. So now I have some legs, which is great. I just want to make sure they read fairly well at the angle this will be seen at. So that looks okay. I might move the back legs out a little further. So I'll do this with my move brush. I'll change my alpha to more of a smoother fall off. Just move these out. Let's try to get this looking a little nicer from below in case we ever see it from below. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. We'll just press Control-Shift-S to use the smooth function that I've set up. I will also do one other thing. I'm going to switch from this layer. You'll notice the V next to the layer. I'm going to switch it into surface mode by pressing on the V. So now I'm in surface mode. I'm going to go to Crease Clay. Actually, I'll go to Pinch. And now I can choose a sharp alpha and kind of hold down Control, and I can pinch the form so I get a nicer shape, or shape that's more appropriate for the structure that I want it to be. All right. And then I may or may not want to tweak it a little bit more. So going with my move tool and just shift things around just a little bit more, just so I have a nice overall design. Okay. Then I'll go in with my Crease Clay, and I can add some. So I'm using a really, really sharp brush in this case. I can add some creases if I want to. The resolution of my object is going to matter at this point. So if my object is fairly low density, this won't read that well. So rather than that, I'm just going to kind of go with this for now. I think this will work. I will just tighten up the shape. I'm using my Rapid 2 brush, which is good for basic sculpting, just to really clarify the forms. And ultimately, when I'm fairly happy with the shape, I want to re-increase the layer resolution. That way I can get more details and cleaner looking forms. But that looks pretty good for the most part. Let's smooth some of this out. Okay. All right, so that looks like what I want. This front leg, actually, the position of it might be a little bit too prominent, starting to look like some kind of sea turtle. I'm going to just quickly grab this. I'm going to use the pose tool, select object, and I can hold down shift to move my gizmo to put it in the position I want it to be in. As long as I'm moving the gizmo while holding shift, it won't actually manipulate the object. It's just for repositioning. And now once I've got it in the position I want, if I let go of shift and change things, that will be applied to my object. So that's a little bit better. Control D to deselect, save. Again, I don't want this to crash on me. I'll do the same thing for this. Click on that. Just scale this down some. Control D, deselect. Same thing for this. And this one's not getting selected for some reason. Interesting. So that's a bug, unfortunately. It's not too bad. I'm going to switch from surface mode to voxel mode to see if I can select it now. So some tools are available in just surface mode, and some tools are available in just voxel mode. And some tools are available in both modes. I'm just going to press Control Z to go back to surface mode because it's still not working. It's a bug. I'll just save this. I'm going to do one last thing. I'm just going to right click on this. I'm going to extrude the whole layer a little bit. So set the extrusion level and just make these a little bit chunkier. Switch over to voxel mode. I like to do smooth all in voxel mode because it gives me cleaner shapes, more beautiful forms, like nicer looking forms. So that's generally why I would do that. I will just tighten this up a little bit. All right. Okay, so now with that, I'm gonna start turning this into geometry. Let me fix these guys, the shape of these. So I'm just gonna hover over it and press H, and you'll notice over here, my layer will switch to this layer. So basically that's just a quick selection. I'm gonna go into my move brush. I will choose a brush with a pointy alpha. I can hold down Control while clicking on something to basically move out on the surface normal. So it's going to move it directly outwards from that position. That's probably too pointy. That's okay, I'll fix it after. Okay. Let me get these ones working as well. Again, I'm going to use some of the same tools, so Control Shift S to smooth everything out. And remember, that's not a hotkey by default. That's a hotkey that I set up. But I just want to get these forms. I like the roundness of them. I don't want them to be too menacing, too threatening. I want this to be a little bit silly. So I think that's working. I'll go in with my move tool again, just adjust some of the position of these objects. And then ultimately I'm going to have to turn off symmetry and make sure that things like this, so on this side is working pretty well, but on this side it's not working as well, so I'll have to move this this one a little bit further forward. Okay. All right, so that actually works pretty well. Happy with that. I will save it. Okay, now I have to retopologize these things and get them ready for texture painting. So I'm just going to make this invisible momentarily. I'm going to actually make it very visible. I'm just going to see if I can get a shader that gets me part of the way there in terms of what I want these to look like. This metallic texture is kind of nice. Let's see what else I have. Sometimes the texture is tied to the resolution of the object. So because this layer is fairly low res, the texture is not reading that well on the shader. So I'm just increasing the resolution a little bit. I think one of these, I think this one is the one that's going to work for me. And then for the legs, again, press H to switch over to that layer quickly. Could try the same thing. For the legs, it's not as important, but for the legs, I will do the same kind of texture. Same thing, I'll just increase the resolution on this layer. So it reads a little bit better. Okay, so now you'll notice actually I have 2 million polygons showing. So I've really bumped this up quite a lot. I pressed Control Plus, which I've basically set to be a hotkey. This one here, which basically subdivides my entire voxel layer. So I pressed that a few times to bring this layer from about 20,000 triangles to the spikes layer is about 1.8 million triangles. The legs are now about 360,000 triangles. So again, greater density is good for this next step that we're going to take. One last thing, I wanted to do. I'm going to turn on symmetry or my symmetry options. I'm going to unenable symmetry, turn it off momentarily. See if my pose tool is working again. And it's not. So that's not ideal. I'll work around it for now. Rather than closing and restarting, I'll just work around this for now. I can always tweak it in the tweak room later on, once it's a paint object. All right, so now the next step that I want to do is I want to give these more sensible geometry. So again, if I press W, you'll see my turtle here. It's fairly low polygon object, right? And the detail is coming from primarily the texture. So I want to do something similar with these guys. So I'm going to right click on spike and I'm going to do auto topo. So I'm going to do auto topo for per pixel. And then what this is basically going to do, it's going to try to give it more optimized topology so that's ready for use in a game engine or real-time graphics. So basically the required poly count, so this is me setting the desired amount of polygons. So 1,000 is fairly high, but it's not horrible. So I'll go for 1,000 for the spikes. And I'll go ahead and click OK. This is a process you can also do manually. But because these are not really going to ever be deforming or anything like that, I don't mind doing it this way. Because it generally produces fairly good results. If you've used ZBrush, this is very similar to ZRemesher. The main difference is this is not used to continue sculpting, it's used to move next to the next step on the pipeline, which is generally going to be unwrapping and texturing. So I said I wasn't going to talk that much, but I'm talking quite a lot, which is okay. All right, so some problems. So some of them worked, but these ones in the middle did not for some reason. That's strange. That's very strange. Not horrible. I can easily fix this. I'm going to temporarily turn off the visibility of my sculpt object or my paint object. Go back to my retopo room, and I'm just going to manually retopologize these. So make sure turn symmetry off momentarily. I will go to my strokes tool, drag from outside the mesh across. It's going to create an orange loop like that. Okay. And then basically I'm just going to draw a vertical loop. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the number of segments, I don't want it to be 12. I want that to be 8. And you'll see what this does is basically when I draw a cross stroke on the object this time, and press enter, it's going to draw the topology there. I do have to cap it off. So I have to create the top. And what I'll do, I'll just basically create a point. And, oh, sorry, points faces. Create a point here, and then I can basically fill in the remaining faces. I'll momentarily bring back my sculpt object just to see. I want to make sure that this is fully poking through my mesh, so I'm not seeing any of it, which is good. I can also add another loop here. I'll go to my brush tool, and I can smooth this out so it's kind of more similar to what these are looking like. So this might seem like, the tedious part, but, it's not so bad once you get used to it. If you're used to doing 3D, this is just part of the process. So. All right, so I'll do the same thing for the other ones. It's kind of tricky because I have all these points I want to avoid. So go ahead and draw a cross stroke here. Just enter. If I want a few more loops, I can go to my points faces tool, just hold down Control, and I get a few more cuts there. You'll notice up here we have in certain tools like points faces, I have the control modifier. So I can basically dictate to the program what it should do when I hold down Control. So in my case, it's adding a split, so split rings, which is very useful. All right, so I will close this off. I will add a points faces, just like I did for the other one. Maintain my quad base mesh. I'll add a loop here, and I'll go into my brush tool, just smooth this out. So we have something like that. Okay. You'll notice it's automatically snapping to the underlying mesh. Normally, I wouldn't have to go through this step. The auto retopo should do this, but like I said, these recent versions of the program, they're adding a lot of new functionality, and I found that these are what I'm actually using right now is a beta version, but it is fairly buggy. Probably shouldn't be using a beta version, but anyways, it's a different story. We'll do this last one. All right. And points, faces, just close this off. Not a loop. Smooth it out. Okay. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to make a UV set out of this. So I'm going to create a new UV set, add new UV set. So this is basically so I can texture on this object. So I'll call this spikes. And I want to switch to that UV set. And I want to select all of the objects on my spike retopo object. So right here, these retopo objects, basically the low poly version of my object. So if I click here, it's going to select everything that's on this layer. I want to go here, move selected to the UV set spikes. Now if I switch to spikes, I'll be able to see these. So if I start cutting these out, I'll actually delete some of these polygons because I don't really need them. So I don't need these because they're hidden below the surface of my turtle's shell. Oops. All right. I might be able to get rid of this. Okay, so hopefully that looks good. And then I'll add my UVs markers. So I'm going to go to edge loops here. And I'll basically just cut a loop on each of these. So the best way to think of this is if I want to turn this into something that I can paint on, just again, so we can flatten it out. So it's a nice paintable object. Okay, I'm going to turn symmetry back on, just so I don't have to duplicate my work. Ideally, you put these seams in places where they won't be that visible. It's not as huge of an issue like nowadays, just because we have software like this, and like Substance Painter, where we can paint directly on the object, and it didn't work on the other side. Yeah. All right, so that's good. So now with these seams marked, I can basically unwrap this, and you'll see the UV preview is going to be populated with something. I can also hover over my objects, and it's going to give me a preview of what this is going to look like. So this is basically what the unwrap will look like, and I just want to make sure that it looks flat. Everything looks fairly flat, so that's all good. And then basically I can go to unwrap. Once I have my seams selected, I can go and unwrap. And then basically now I'm going to have a unwrapped mesh. I want to do the same thing for my legs. So before I even do that, I'm just going to create a new UV set. I'll call this legs. And I'm going to switch to that UV set. So nothing's on it currently, but my legs will be on it. So I can actually just right click on my legs here, or right click on my legs in the Vox tree. As long as I'm able to see the Vox tree, I can right click on it and I can go to auto topo for per pixel. And again, I'll go for 1,000. And you notice in retopo objects, I'll get a new layer called legs. It's going to bring the layer from my Vox tree layer, and that will be my retopo object. It's going to be a low poly version that I ultimately will be texture painting. So that's looking good. I'm going to click cancel here. If I clicked OK, it would actually go ahead and bake this down. So I don't want to do that just yet. I just want to get rid of any, again, geometry I don't really need. And because I didn't have symmetry turned on when I did this, these meshes won't be completely symmetrical. That could be the reason, or it could just be that this is a buggy version of the software. But normally I'd like it if I could do this on one side and it's automatically doing it to the other side too. Saves me half the work. All right. All right, so the same thing I did before. I'm going to cut some mark seams. So again, I'm looking at this preview just to make sure that the unwrap looks decent. All right. So this one doesn't look good. Oh, this one has okay. So again, I'm just previewing them to make sure that everything will look pretty okay when I unwrap it. This one's problematic. I'll fix that. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and click unwrap again. This time it's going to go on my legs UV set. I could combine the legs and the spikes into one layer. But if I keep it separate like this, it'll be easier for me to make some changes dynamically if I want to have a different texture for the shell and a different texture for the spikes, a different texture for the legs. I can always do that just by swapping in and out different texture files that make use of those UV coordinates. So rotate this. Okay, not great usage of my UV space. Let me see if I can get this a little bit better. That's better. And you know what? I think I will get everything on the same thing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select everything here. I'm going to go to my spikes layer. I'm just going to rename it. So I'll call this spikes and legs. Okay, and I'm going to go back to my legs layer, make sure everything's selected, and then go to move selected to spikes and legs. And so now you'll see that everything is going to be on spikes and legs, but unfortunately, I have some things overlapping other things, which I don't want. I want each of these islands to have its own unique space within this square. So all I have to do is everything's already unwrapped. I just have to go to press unwrap again, and it will automatically try to position things in a way where they're not overlapping. And yeah, so I'll just do that. Unwrap. And then ideally, I would spend some time just making sure everything is really nice. And I'm using as much of this square space as I can so that I get more bang for my buck when I do decide to add textures. So I'm just trying to, ideally I could kind of position everything really nice and tight and then make everything a little bit bigger. All these islands just a little bit bigger. So that they're, again, able to kind of have more space for textures. Okay, that should be fairly good. One thing I might do, I might want to position these so that everything that's the same type is a little bit more grouped together. Okay, so that's pretty good. So once I'm happy with this, then I'm going to basically do what's called baking, where I'm going to take my sculpt objects and I'm going to bake any details, any textures or shaders, and that's going to bake down onto this low poly mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and go to bake while I'm in my Retopo tab. I go to bake, bake with normal map, the yellow one, and then this is what I want to pay attention to. It's going to show me an outer shell and an inner shell. I want to make sure that on my inner shell, I can't see any parts of the mesh poking through my sculpt. And on the outer shell, I want to make sure that no parts of my sculpt are poking through the mesh. Ideally, I'll get these numbers as tight as possible. So if I set that to 5 and 5, it should give me a better result. I just want to, again, make sure nothing's poking through. So that looks good. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now, one thing I'm not sure, I don't know if it's just going to do the one layer. I guess we'll see. Oh, so everything actually, sorry, is on one layer. Nope, they're both on different layers. So let's see what happens. So if I go to Paint Objects now, hide the visibility of my voxel object, then I'll see that I've got these guys. Right here, what's happened is part of my sculpt is probably poking through my retopo mesh. So that's something I need to fix. And also you're seeing a noisy kind of bumpiness to this. That's because the normal map was a little bit too strong. So all of my shaders have a normal parameter, and that in this case was probably a little on the strong side. So I can reduce the opacity of my depth on this layer. Oops, make sure I'm on the right layer. So I have two. I have spikes and I have legs. So on spikes, I want to reduce the opacity of the depth. So this, again, this is more so what we had last week. Now I'm in the Paint tab, where I'm actually working on the texture painting. So again, just reduce the opacity here on the spikes. Set this to say 25%. For the depth, set lower, 15. And same thing for the legs. Still a little bit noisy. Just make sure that these are the right layers. Oh, I see what it is. So what's happening, the depth is not from this layer, it's actually from my normal map layer. Okay, so my normal map, I have to set that, the depth on that to about, say 25%. There we go, a lot better. So now I want to make my paint objects all visible again. So windows, pop-ups, paint, objects, and then just make sure my turtle is visible. So now I have this, and if I press W, you'll see that everything now is just a low poly paint object. So I can basically continue my texture painting. What I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off, or I'm going to lock some of these layers. So I'm going to lock my turtle robot, and I'm going to lock my legs. And I want to do some painting just on the spikes. So on a new layer, I'm going to choose a paint material, something like this. I'll use my Smart Material Preview just to preview what this is going to look like. I'll play with my parameters here. Up top, I have set to always, but I want to do less on convex, so less on pointy surfaces. Or let's try more on flat. Getting some strange results here. So it's kind of reading the seams here. So unfortunately, guys, I apologize. This is probably not a wise idea to use a beta, but that's what happens. So normally I roll back to something that is a little bit more stable, but we should be able to find a workaround. More on flat. contrast or degree. Yeah. So let's see if I calculate, I'm going to calculate occlusion again. Well, we're pretty much at time, guys. Wow. I'll go for a little bit longer, and then we'll wrap up. Textures, calculate occlusion. So the curvature map is, again, basically just telling me which parts are pointy and which parts are concave. And let's try this again. Less on convex. So that's working a little bit better. More along the lines of what I wanted. There we go. That's better. I don't know why it all of a sudden decided to work. I think I didn't have a curvature map before. Usually it's going to prompt me. It's going to say you need a curvature map for this particular material. But it didn't in this case. So we'll go ahead and add this. Fill hole, whoops. And then I'll add this one on top. Just increase my degree here. So I will fill hole layer. Sorry, I missed that step. Fill hole layer, and then on the layer above, I will apply this one and just increase the degree. Interesting. And go ahead and fill hole layer. There we go. So that's the effect that I wanted. Let me turn off my wireframe. So basically from here, I would just go in and start painting in more detailed texturing that I want. For some reason, the ambient occlusion is not working quite the way I had hoped. I can paint in my own ambient occlusion just by, oh, you know why it didn't work? Because I had the turtle robot locked. Let's unlock that. Let's unlock the legs. I'll delete my ambient occlusion here. I will delete both of those. Let's try it again to see if it works. Textures, calculate occlusion, and this is basically just going to darken the space, the area next to as objects get close to each other. And no, still same thing. Strange. So normally this works perfectly again. In the future, I'll make sure I'm using a stable release unless I absolutely need a newer feature. So with this, I am going to go here. And yeah, this is unfortunately a little unstable. Next week I'll make sure that we have a nice. I'm working with a stable version as we kind of tighten things up and finish things off. I will probably change a couple more things here. I'll just create one more layer. Make sure I lock my turtle robot and my legs. Go back to this paint. Bring back my preview. Okay. So that's pretty good. I will fill the layer with this. Okay, and close that. And then I'll probably just adjust the layer opacity on this. So I get some of the underlying layers showing through a little bit more. And there we go. So we'll end here, guys. So hopefully that was helpful. Next week we'll continue the texture input process, and now that we have all our geometry, we'll be able to nail this guy down and finish him off. Like I said, I will use a stable release just so that everything does work as intended. All right, but thanks again.